One.
Okay, welcome to our second panel in the framework of our online conference entitled Areas of Cooperation and Conflict, Religious Communities and Civil Society. As some of you might have followed, the first panel took place last Thursday, and we're having the second panel now, and there are two more to follow in the coming weeks. Our panel today, as the one last week, is devoted to practical experiences of interaction between civil society and religious communities, and to reflect on the potential and challenges of cooperation in a comparative perspective, but mostly from a bottoms-up, practical experience of people working in this field. We have to reconfigure today's panel slightly, so we are joined, well, I will first tell you who is not being able to join us. So Miroslav Kevesdi and Elizabeta Kitanovic, unfortunately, have not been able to join us for the panel today. But I'm very glad to have, first of all, Zilka Spahić Šiljak joining us, and Angela Ilić as well, who is joining us to complement to this panel. And I will first introduce the two, and then the way we're going to be proceeding is that we'll have a brief reflection of around 10 minutes, and then a round of questions from my side, conversation really, and then afterwards there's space for questions from the audience. And again, as a reminder, if you put in your questions on YouTube, you have to first be registered there, and those questions then get fed back to us, and we're able to address them as they are posed. So first of all, Zilka, thank you for joining us. You received a PhD from Gender Studies and an MA in Human Rights and Religious Studies as a BA. So you have a broad scope of field. You've worked on human rights, religion, education, and peace building. Zilka, you are affiliated with University of Zenica and the Roehampton University in London. So this is from Zenica to London, thus on your affiliation, and author of several books on questions of gender and religious identity, including The Balkan Labyrinth, Culture, Gender, and Leadership, which is just published this year, as well as previous work published in Bosnia and in the UK on issues of women, religion, and politics, and the role of women in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So thank you for joining us and sharing some of your experience. And Angela is well known to those who've been at the previous panel. She's a researcher at the partner in Munich, the partner institution, the Institute for German Culture and the History of Southeastern Europe at the University of Munich. So she's our second panelist who will respond afterwards. And just to introduce myself, my name is Florian Bieber, and I'm the director of the Center for Southeast European Studies at the University of Graz. And our center is one of the partner organizations of this workshop. So without further ado, and just to get the conversation started, Zilka, I would give you the floor to reflect on some of the kind of larger questions, as we agreed, about the relationship between civil society and religious communities in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and in particular your experience as you've had it through your engaged work over the years. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Florian. I'm happy to be here and to discuss these issues with you and Angela. For the beginning, I would like to say a few words about civil society organizations in Bosnia and Herzegovina in general, because these organizations play a supporting role in the country's emerging post-conflict and post-socialist democracy, and their achievements should be neither underestimated or overestimated. So this sector includes over thousands and thousands of CCOs. It's a large number of CCOs, and most of them are not active. Most of them are also very small associations that operates in the field of social services, cultural activities, and advocacy. There are also some organizations like sports clubs or veterans associations that enjoy close relationship with the state and the ruling ethnopolitical parties, and therefore, I mean, they receive large proportion of the budget allocated for civil society. So in civil society in Bosnia and Herzegovina, we also have large professional organizations that have close links to foreign donors that are engaged in fostering democracy, human rights promotion, and also to provide some kind of a counterbalance to ethno-national divisions. Apart from these few organizations, the general public visibility of civil sector in Bosnia is rather low due to, I would say, mutual mistrust between the media and civil society organizations. And if we take into account the decentralized and federated nature of the state, two entities and cantonal governments plus Brčko district, the legal framework, which is pretty much fragmented and disenfranchised administration, and that we have only about 12% of civil society organizations that are registered at the state level in the Ministry of Justice. And most others operate within their local communities, canton, or municipality. So one of the problems with civil society organizations is also a question of tax deductibility for charitable donations, which is unfavorable totally. So, for instance, the culture of philanthropy is rather low. Then volunteer activism and social entrepreneurship are not sufficiently developed. And as we are now in the phase when foreign funding is decreasing, so we can also expect increasing political influence in that sector. And even right now, our big international donors require, for instance, civil society organizations to provide 30 or 40% budget from governments, and knowing what governmental structures we have in the country means that you cannot criticize them or go against them or say something in public against them. But in general, I mean, civil society hasn't been developed enough in this region and in Bosnia. So, and we need to work more on that. And if you take into account also that Bosnian society is in steady political, economic, and cultural decline, so the space for civil society and its activities is becoming narrower, and citizens in general are losing trust in civil societies. One of the problems also, as some authors noticed when they analyze the situation, is so-called projectization or NGization of civil society, because most of them are donor-driven projects. You know, when we have projects, we work. When we don't have, most of organizations stop working. So it's really a problem that there is no grassroots civil society activism strongly developed in the region. And also political parties and religious communities are closely related to some of the civil society organizations. Churches support some of them. And in general, in accordance to the law, although religious communities and churches are their work is regulated in accordance to specific law, they're also part of civil society. They should be part, but they behave like they are not. But they support some of them. So we have so many humanitarian philanthropic organizations that are established by the Islamic community or the Catholic Church, the Serbian Orthodox Church, or Jewish community. These are the four main religious communities in the country. So in that way, they maintain a monopoly on preservation and keeping of ethnic and religious identity, and the two are always overlap in the public discourse of religious communities. So these major religious communities, four of them, as I mentioned, and then the ruling political parties are often considered to promote traditional or more conservative values, and from this position, they both tend to be suspicious to some civil society organizations, which are considered to stand liberal or progressive, to stand for liberal or progressive values. So these parties are often labeled as leftist and considered as successors of communist ideology. And they usually have more connections with some organizations like trade unions, former workers' council, etc. And they enjoy support from liberally oriented civil society. So even civil society somehow is divided. Formally, we can say that civil society organizations are independent from political parties and religious communities, but in practice, then most of them are not. And some of them are more inclined toward liberal political agendas, and others lean toward conservative agendas. So most of them are not fully independent from international donors because they depend on that support, to do the activities in the field. When it comes to religious institutions, these four I mentioned before, they're legally registered and acknowledged as in the law from 2004 as historical churches and religious communities that have been present here for centuries. And these are Islamic communities, Serbian Orthodox Church, Roman Catholic, and Jewish community. And these four enjoy a privileged position compared to other minority religious groups like some Protestant churches, etc. It is most evident through very generous public subsidies for their activities. For instance, when you analyze the budget of cantons and entities and the state, how much they allocate for them is pretty much generous in comparison to the budget allocated to other civil society organizations. There is, as I said, there is misunderstanding, and there is also antagonism that prevails between religious institutions, churches, and civil society organizations. And it is really hard to navigate in that field and to find a common ground and to do the work together. So, but despite all of these facts, there is a way, and there are some positive examples I would like to share with you today of faith-based civil society organizations and those who use religion as one of arguments. They are secular religious organizations like TPO Foundation, but they use religion as one of the arguments in this debate and their work. And they work mostly in the field of interreligious dialogue, interethnic dialogue, reconciliation, peace building, education and integration of peace building and then peace pedagogy in education. And these examples are not unique. There are dozens of these kind of initiatives, but what is specific about them is that the programs I will be talking about are integrated officially in Sarajevo canton, and it will be integrated in several other cantons. So which means that the programs have been implemented in close collaboration with cantonal ministries of education, as well as with the support of religious communities and churches. Without that support, it wouldn't be possible to work within the system. What we realized over time with all the activities that have been done in this region if you are not able to intervene within the system, everything what you do will be somehow on the margin, isolated, and it will not yield substantial results. So today, I will briefly present two initiatives. One is Ethos Initiative, and the second is SAPRE, Philosophy and Critical Thinking, run by TPO Foundation and several other CCOs in Bosnia and Herzegovina, but also in the region, because we expanded the work of these two initiatives to Croatia, Serbia, and Montenegro. And this is a successful story. And the aim was, to introduce peace pedagogy in teaching, to help teachers to deal with intercultural and interreligious dialogue. But before that, they had to be empowered with intercultural and interreligious skills, critical thinking skills that are missing from our education system, which is pretty much old-fashioned, post-socialist. And in order to help them to transcend monocultural model of thinking and behaving to ethno-relative, so they had to go through rigorous education for years to be able to work within the system. This is not an easy process at all, and there are lots of obstacles, and also some teachers are reluctant to join, but some of them are thrilled to be part of it because they see that it's possible to make some changes in the educational system. So what we have done after 6 years of intensive implementation of these programs, we conducted interviews with those who were directly involved and those who were indirectly part of these two programs. We wanted to know the feedback and what was successful and why these programs are important for the Bosnian context. Why these two initiatives are important? What is special about them? I would say, first of all, because both combine religious and non-religious resources for peace pedagogy and intercultural learning, and they try to bridge the gap between religious education and other subjects, which is not the case with most of intercultural education in the region. In general, if you look at what European Commission, EU, at EU level, what's been done, most of the documents and what UNICEF and other big organizations do, they do intercultural dialogue, intercultural education. There is no religion at all. Religion is not part of the conundrum. And it is really important if we work in societies like Bosnia and in the Balkans in general, where religious identification is really high. I don't want to go into that in detail, to check how many really practice religion, but if more over 85, or according to some research, over 90% citizens declare religious identity, which means that religion is an important part of identity and life. So we have to take it into account. And also, if we know that religious education was introduced during the war in 1994, and it's there, it's not helpful just to criticize it and say, okay, we would like to have cultural studies or history of religion or ethics. Yeah, nice, but how to do that? Because we had one situation, and I will make a small digression here. When I ran a religious studies program at the University of Sarajevo years ago, and the aim was to produce enough teachers to be able to teach cultural studies and history of religions. And after 2 generations, they closed it down. And the Minister of Education in Canton Sarajevo, in that period, he was from Social Democratic Political Party, didn't understand the situation. He said, okay, he would overnight replace confessional religious education with non-confessional. And we told him that's not possible, and that's not the way how to do that. And of course, he was replaced in 3 days. So which means that you cannot or overturn everything in a week or a few days. So in the ethnically divided education system, like the Bosnian system is, so peace pedagogy is really important, and it can flourish only through collaborative learning and activities of all teachers, regardless of the subject they teach, the language, history, geography, mathematics, or religious studies, confessional education. So they gather teachers from a variety of backgrounds, including social science, humanities, religious education, Islamic study teacher, and Christian study teacher. So to work together and to try to integrate universal ethical values and critical thinking methods in teaching. So not to create one more new subject to teach, but to integrate methods and the way of teaching in the existing subjects. And as we all know, religion is often designated as part of the problem, not only in Bosnia, but all around the world, and very seldom as part of the solution. So the fact is that in this post-socialist context of Bosnia and Herzegovina and the entire Balkans region, religion remained as a powerful tool of ethnic and social and political mobilization of all three main ethnic and slash religious groups. And one of the important channels to stretch their impact is religious confessional education. So teaching doctrines, education in public schools, as I mentioned, that was introduced in 1994. So confessional religious education is there for so many years. And as religious communities try to explain that it was a kind of a victory against atheist ideology of communism. So in a way, so they got a chance, to teach religion again in public school system. So in the ethnically divided context, like the Bosnian society is with complex education system, segregated two schools under one roof, peace pedagogy is really important to heal the wounds from the war, to give hope for the future. And that's why these two initiatives, Ethos Initiative and SAPRE, Bosnia and Herzegovina with critical thinking methods, are important because they offer new approaches for intercultural and interreligious understanding and learning, and with the aim to bridge the secular religious divide. And both programs address gap between ethnic, religious, and cultural differences, and try to be and provide to be a vehicle for teachers and students to learn and to grow together. So simply to be able to work together, because so far most of the education, additional education, capacity building education for teachers was divided. Religious studies teachers had their own, and other teachers their own. So they haven't collaborated so much. And one of the results and the feedbacks we've received was that particularly for religious studies teachers who felt somehow marginalized and as outcast in public school system sometimes, it was really important that someone came and then said, the entire school should work together and to work across subject and across disciplines. So I would stop here. I think I talked more than 10 minutes, and then we can discuss this more.
Thank you very much, Zilka, because I think you raised some very important questions, which I think apply well beyond Bosnia and Herzegovina. Maybe they're more visible in Bosnia and Herzegovina than elsewhere, but I think I want to just pick out a few which I think are matter. I mean, I think one is, of course, the larger challenges of civil society and their regional when it comes to the social acceptance of civil society organizations. I mean, the difficulty that, again, what you call, the projectification, the enjoyification, and so on. So the challenge that civil society is often not seen as a genuine articulation of civic interests, but rather as seen as something which is much more based on the idea of top-down, of donor-driven initiatives. So this is something which, I'm sorry, just give me a second. And this is, I think, one challenge we're having. The other challenge we're having is that we're having a situation where the kind of ability to mobilize across the ability to mobilize in society through non-institutionalized ways. I mean, because a lot of, there might be civil societies which are not NGOs, right? So social movements, other activities are often ignored or not kind of captured by what we understand as civil society. So I think this is another question of the kind of, what you also mentioned, how religious institutions are often don't see themselves and are not seen as part of the civil society. And I think this is another important question. And I think the one thing which I want to pick up before I give Angela the floor is really the issue of the issue of basically this divide, the secular religious divide, or the divide that basically both in civil society as well as in society at large, civil society, that there's a view that what is religious is unacceptable for secular and vice versa, that there's this gap. And I think what you're pointing out is, in fact, to kind of how to bridge this, how to basically make these processes more inclusive and see that dealing with the challenges of society, rather than seeing it as an either or as an antagonistic relationship, to how to foster a cooperation between those who share the same goals in a, let's say, from a more secular perspective, as well as those from a more religious perspective. And I think this is a larger challenge across the region of the tradition of some civil society, which is very much secular and has no conception, sees, as you said, religion as a problem and not something to engage with, and vice versa. And I think how to deal with this, I think you're giving some examples, but I think this strikes me as really an important challenge to reflect on. And I think this is exactly what our conference wants to do, is to find ways to kind of break out of this conundrum rather than taking it as given. So I would give the floor now to Angela to reflect, that she can reflect a little bit on her experience, because she's also worked on a number of such projects which might provide for some insights into this particular, into some of these dilemmas we've seen already.
Thank you. Yes, I think it's very, very interesting to hear Zilka's experience. She raised a lot of very, very important and very valid points, I think, for the entire region. I think one topic I would like to definitely emphasize, and I think this is something true for much of the region, although I think it's Bosnia that's kind of an exception to that, is the dynamics of majority-minority religious communities. Because not that this does not exist in Bosnia, but of course you have a political and social system that's trying to somehow keep a balance among all of them. But in most of the other countries, these dynamics not only influence the functioning and the everyday life of the religious communities, but they also are reflected in their political or non-political civil society engagement as well. And I think that's a very important point to talk about, because we have seen since the political changes in the region over the last few decades, in many of these countries, religious communities becoming receiving preferential treatment. We've seen kind of the rising of national churches, even though they may not be officially legally established churches, they are still receiving preferential treatment. There are very, very clear-cut cases of this in Romania, in Serbia, in Croatia, just to mention a few. And in those situations, of course, this also is reflected in how they relate to the minority religious communities and how the minority religious communities relate to the majority one, and of course how they are all relating to the state and to society in general. And we have also seen this societal perception of civil society as in many ways being negative, not only in the case of religious communities where it might be attributed to the fact that they are religious communities and are therefore not seen as welcome, but also because we have seen sometimes from governments themselves witch hunts and also just a general stirring up of distrust in the general public. I mean, the most recent examples, or probably the most prominent ones from the recent years, come from Hungary, where there has been a real turnaround in the societal perception of civil society actors in general. So we see some of that as well. But this minority-majority relation and dynamic, of course, influences also how the religious communities among themselves work together when it's somehow connected to civil society issues or questions. One experience that I personally had was in the middle of the 2000s in Serbia, trying to bring together a forum of various religious communities on the basis of one cause. And the cause was that Serbia, as the last one in the region, was finally preparing to draft a law that would regulate the relationship of religious communities to the state, and it would also regulate their legal position. No such law existed since the breakup of Yugoslavia, and so churches and religious communities were operating in a legal vacuum, which of course some could use to their own advantage in many ways, and they did in terms of actually operating all kinds of organizations, I think most importantly in the field of humanitarian and developmental aid. But on the other hand, they were not able to function as legal entities, which of course had many negative sides. So not surprisingly, it was the minority communities that were most interested in forming a platform together to kind of try to talk to the government and influence this process so that it would become a law that would reflect not only the interests of the state, but also that of the religious communities. Parallel to that was another development taking place, a law concerning the return of nationalized property to religious communities was being prepared. This was another major legal hole in the system for several decades, that property had not been returned, property that had been nationalized after World War II had not been returned to private persons or to organizations or to religious communities. So both of these laws were being prepared at roughly the same time. And although we had built this platform with the minority communities, the majority church had for quite a long time no real interest in joining this until the draft law concerning the return of property to religious communities started putting in stipulations that would also be to their detriment. And then when they realized, well, this is actually something that can affect every single one of us as religious communities, they joined this platform to be able to negotiate and to express the concerns of the religious communities themselves to the government. This is, of course, just one example, but living in the region, you experience these kinds of dynamics of oftentimes the minority communities being very willing to work with the others, while those who are in the absolute majority do not necessarily see the need for that or see the advantages of such cooperation. but I think it's very, very good to hear about, especially about these cross-border initiatives that you mentioned, because that is something that that I think needs to be more of. I think one more aspect that's maybe important to emphasize in the case of religious communities and civil society. Religious communities are almost all of them are connected somehow internationally, right? Through their own networks of confessional or religious solidarity. And so when the borders open or when the political systems change in the whole region, of course, churches and religious communities were trying to reestablish these networks and these connections to their co-religionists in other countries or around the entire world, which had been very frowned upon and even forbidden, yeah, in the socialist times. And we have also seen very different reactions to that. In some cases, this has been, of course, also used by governments and by political parties to say, well, look at this. They are actually being financed as a religious community from abroad, even though that may not have been true, but they also use that to sow seeds of distrust against certain religious communities. So we have seen even the civil society work of certain religious communities being politicized in a way when it was actually far from their actual practice on the ground.
Thanks, Angela. I think of course, what you're drawing the attention to is the challenge of being of religious minorities. I mean, both religious minorities and national minorities, which are also religious minorities. And I think we see this in particular, of course, a challenge when the minority happens to be from religion close to the majority religion, when the competition is in a certain way, often within Orthodox churches, for example, very explicit, and it's the recognition question that comes up. And then, of course, the nexus, which is also there, is the role of the state and how the state positions itself. So we see, of course, if you just draw your attention, of course, on Montenegro, which has seen massive mobilization of the majority church against the state due to the law, but usually, in fact, it is more minorities who would feel marginalized by the legal landscape. But of course, there we saw social mobilization. I mean, it's not civil society, but it's social movements. I mean, people going on the streets and protesting, and we can assess, of course, the church's role in multiple ways. But it's very clear that you see people, and I think this comes back to Zilka's point. I mean, people identify with religious communities. I mean, how religious they are in everyday practice is a whole different story, but they identify with them as carriers of identity. And so if, in fact, that these communities argue that their position is infringed upon, then this is a very strong mobilizing factor, both for positive and for difficult ways. So I think this is an interesting, and I think the question really is, as Angela, as you were pointing out, is like, when can you build coalitions? When can you build cross-religious coalitions, which go beyond, so in a certain way, Zilka brought up the issue of religion, of coalitions between those, let's say, who have a more secular outlook on civil society and those who have a more religious one, to kind of cross that boundary. And Angela, you're raising the question of how to kind of cross the gap between minority and majority religious communities. So, I mean, I would take that kind of that observation to Zilka and ask you, I mean, how do you see the ability, space of cooperation across religious boundaries? I mean, because especially in Bosnia, religious communities are so associated with with nations, how much is it possible in a certain way to have, kind of joint engagement, cross-religious engagement in a productive way, which in a certain way works with different religious communities, even though, of course, when you have this kind of tension, right, in Bosnia, where on one side there's this kind of, there are platforms for interreligious dialogue, but at the same time, of course, in terms of everyday life, the antagonistic legacy of the war is still very much present. So what are the spaces for cross-religious cooperation, especially when we're talking about civil society? What's your experience there?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what you said, but I think it's important to approach the religious communities in different way, different from what we used to so far. When we talk to them, they mostly refer to civil society organizations as aggressive, those who attack constantly, those who do not want to talk. And then if you constantly use the discourse of attacking someone, they will just withdraw and they will not communicate. So what I learned from my humble experience in the last 20 years is that working in civil society, had to prepare us to always keep the window or door open. So we should find a way how to keep the door open. If we close all the doors and windows, so there is no way to communicate across all of these differences, we will not agree in all issues. Of course, there will be disagreement in different perspectives, but what is important to have a channel for communication. I'll give you just one example. Some of you maybe know Goran Bubalo, who passed away. He ran Peace Network in Bosnia and Herzegovina. He was such a nice person and a human rights activist and friend of mine. And a couple of years ago, Minister for Foreign Affairs from Sweden came to Bosnia with the idea to build a park, a peace park to honor women peace builders. Great idea. And she had a meeting with the prime minister at that time. And of course, when they wanted to implement that idea and the agreement between the two ministers, between the minister and the prime minister of two countries, they didn't know who could have done it. So, and one day they invited me and Goran. And you know what they told us? You are one of rare two human rights activists who didn't close all the doors with state institutions and religious communities. So which means that in civil society, of course, we have to criticize what is wrong, but the way how we do that sometimes is not okay. And we have to be really cautious and show respect, even in situations when we completely disagree, but show respect in communication. And then two of us have done that work, communicated with the municipalities and the local authorities. During one of these meetings, one of the ladies told us in the end that they checked both of us. And when they saw that we basically are very much critical towards the government and the national elites, but we didn't go to offend people on personal level and also to denigrate someone's dignity and etc. etc. So there is possibility, and I noticed when we approached to Catholic Church and Islamic community with these two programs, and when we explain everything to them, for instance, in Islamic community, they know that I'm feminist. They know that I'm standing for feminist agenda. They know everything, but they also know that I'm fully respectful to the work they do and their willingness to cooperate. And we got both of them to collaborate on these projects. So I would say that there are possibilities only if we are able to listen more and to pay respect and then to find people within these communities who are willing to collaborate, to explain them the idea well, and then it's possible. And also to include them as one of the owners of the entire process. So they cannot be those in service, we will use you. And then, yeah, this is one of the arguments that they often share, that they feel most of the time that they are used as a services for some big international organizations or other organizations. So they want to be partners, and they want to be those who are owners of the process with other organizations.
Thanks. I think these are 2 points which are very important. I mean, I think the last one is, of course, and this is, I think, part of the problem which you've identified in the first round of civil societies, that they're often also seen as a service provider by donors, and that has, of course, transformed many organizations into those who provide studies, humanitarian aid, whatever else, on behalf of external donors. And I mean, of course, there's a role for these kind of organizations, but they often dominate also the understanding of civil society. So they're not understood as ones which articulate citizens' ideas in a broad way, and as a result are having a partnership and a self-generated agenda rather than one which is driven by outside. And I think that's one problem. And I think the other one, which I think you said is very important, is kind of how to keep the doors open or reopen the doors, and in multiple directions, of course, between secular and religious, between also different religious communities, or between civil society who includes people from different religious communities. Because I think this, how to open the doors, it's a challenge, right? Because I mean, and this is the question is then, I mean, it's also what are the topics where to do this on? Because of course there are many topics where it's probably, as you rightly said, it's probably very difficult to find a common ground. You know, when you're talking about, you know, the past of the 1990s, it's probably very difficult to find a common understanding, considering that the reading of the recent past is very antagonistic, very conflictual. And so that's probably not the space where that kind of a dialogue can take place. And it's probably other areas which have to be found where it can take place. And I guess the real challenge is how can you pick those, or what are the topics, what are the fields where you can open the doors? Because again, you cannot claim to be able to just have an open door when it comes to these very painful topics of war crimes and so on, where of course one probably will not make much progress if one can respect positions, but one also is more likely to say that there are certain things which are not negotiable or not something we can discuss, you know. And so I think the question is really, what are the areas where this kind of bridge building or door opening can take place? And I would take that kind of question to Angela and say, you know, I mean, one thing you've said is the example you've given was when it comes to the rights of religious communities in vis-a-vis the state. But do you see other areas where this kind of space could exist, where cross-religious cooperation, especially in the civil society sector, seems promising?
I think there are many possibilities, and some of the hesitation stems from issues that have already been mentioned, partly because many of the initiatives, especially in the field of interreligious dialogue, reconciliation, and peace building, has come from abroad. It has come from outside. It has come, in many cases, from large foreign or international organizations that may come with the best of intentions, but sometimes they also bring views with themselves that simply cause locals to put up their guards against it. Now, I was also involved in interreligious dialogue quite a lot in the United States. There seems to be a view promoted among many practicing interreligious dialogue that you kind of have to have a relativistic view of religions. In other words, to think that yes, all religions are essentially the same, with the same goal, leading in the same direction, which of course is a big stumbling block for someone, especially for those coming from the Abrahamic traditions. So if you already come in with premises like that, you're going to find a lot of resistance to it. What I found in my experience is to step away from that and to not come with, not laying that down on the ground and saying that's one of the ground rules, because I think that's not really going to lead us far. Now, one challenge, of course, is to agree while disagreeing. That is, I think, an art that you kind of have to hone and work on in any situation in life. But what I have personally experienced is that it is possible to come together with members of different religious communities, also for civil society agendas, for pragmatic reasons. And that is something that I've experienced in dialogue with young Muslims in the Sanjak, where Muslims are actually forming the demographic majority in many of the communities in the south of Serbia, of being able to recognize some of the common problems in society that they're facing, together with their Christian and Jewish counterparts. Those issues of emigration because of economic grounds, the issues of corruption, issues of discrimination of minorities of all kinds, systemic discrimination, are affecting everyone. And I think when you gather around certain issues like that and realize, well, this is affecting my neighbor down the street just as much as it's affecting me, then it is possible. So I think the key, or one of the keys, is just trying to also let that happen, as you've already mentioned it, Zilka, happen at a grassroots level, and let the agendas or let the issues be set rather from a grassroots level and not from above, as important as those coming from above may seem.
If I may add, Florian.
Sure, go ahead.
Just yesterday, I had a meeting with one of the USA bigger human rights organization, and they want to do something interfaith in the region. And I said, and who designed the project? They designed it, and in Washington, D.C., like in many situations, these programs are designed in Brussels or New York or any other European or USA center. So, which means even if they have someone from this region, I mean, they don't know the whole story. They don't have a full picture. And again, the situation that they are making the local civil society organizations, not as partners, but those who are in service for them. So, and they told me, yeah, you can say that in the evaluation. And I think we need to speak more, against that top-down approach, where all of these, and then that's why I mean they said there is a resistance in some communities. Of course, there is resistance because in the last 20 or more years they have seen so many similar initiatives, that came from some big centers. Someone coined the program and said, oh, this is good for Sarajevo or Vienna or Mostar, so we think this is good for them. And that's why I think we need to work more in partnership, understanding, respect, and channels of communication to bring us together. And I believe, I mean, when you start communicating with religious communities and then to explain it to them that, for instance, if we wanted to preserve dignity of all citizens, I mean, we have to work together, to do it. And then in most of the cases, there is a positive feedback. Of course, as Florian said, there are some issues that are really tough, like the recent past, and we will probably have these antagonistic readings of our past for a long time, but that doesn't mean that we cannot work on some other issues, as we have done after the floods in 2014 and 15. So we used the infrastructure of religious communities, of interreligious councils in local communities to help people who were affected with the flood. But at the same time, through interreligious dialogue, we combine economic incentives for them. So combining human rights, interreligious dialogue with economic empowerment, this is one of the models that can work. But coming to these local communities every time to explain to them what are their human rights, how they should do interreligious or intercultural dialogue or reconciliation, is not helpful if they don't see, some palpable results of it, and if they are not supported. I mean, if they are struggling for everyday life, I mean, it doesn't mean much, to explain to them what the Universal Declaration of Human Rights say, how they should live and what rights they have.
I think, these are, really important points, and I fully agree with you. And I think it's important to kind of really highlight them, is that I think the problem is that sometimes these big terms like interreligious dialogue or reconciliation are used as a project rather than as something which has to evolve organically from a long drawn out process, and no as brilliant plan from anywhere can say this is how interreligious dialogue should take place, but it's rather something which happens because of something else, and by those who actually participate in it, because, as you said, they have an interest and they want to do it, and not because somebody says, I'll hire 10 people and spend X amount of money in doing it. And I think this is exactly the same debate I always criticize when it comes to reconciliation, that reconciliation is not a project. It is something which comes at the end of a very long process, which involves a lot of conversations about many topics. And those have to be determined by those who are part of it, and not by any outsiders. So I think this is fundamentally important. And I think the other point, which both Angela and you, Zilka, mentioned, is the issue of that maybe it might be issues which are not, let's say, core issues of religious life, which bring religious communities together. Angela, you mentioned migration in Sanjak, and Zilka, you mentioned the floods. These are not per se religious issues of interreligious dialogue, but it's issues where people are able to transcend their religious, or where they say that I have my religious identity, and I'm also working together with other people, whether they are belonging to a different religion or not religious, but we share a certain concern. And so we bring in our belief system, our infrastructure, and our worldview into this. But fundamentally, when you're talking about migration or floods, you can have a secular and a religious or a whatever kind of response to it, and that they can work together very well. And so I think it's really finding these places, these moments of cooperation. And I'm just wondering, one thing which, Zilka, I wanted to ask you is also, how is the issue of migration in Bosnia? Is the migrants who are stranded in Bosnia, how much is that a place for this kind of cooperation, or is that already too much politicized or antagonistic that it's become very hard?
If you're asking me, it's a very much politicized and very hot topic here. So 2 years ago, I think, just prior to the pandemic and then the lockdown, last year we had a situation and critique on imams who opened mosques for immigrants and basically who tried to offer some different approaches, to resolving of the problems of migrations. But I think that this is not one of the topics where religious communities collaborate, but I think this is also a source that can use, to engage religious communities to work on that. And maybe IOM, which is one of the biggest organizations in the region that support these issues, they should be sensitive enough to engage religious communities, and I think there is a space for that. It's not used at all, and I think that religious communities from time to time provide humanitarian support, but there is no systemic approach, I would say. There are some cases where they help and provide some support, but systemic approach is not there, and not all the resources that religious communities have at disposal are used, for the purpose of assisting, and then this very, very difficult situation.
The question, I mean, which kind of also I've been kind of curious about. So I mean, in a certain way, I think one of the kind of messages maybe is really also, I mean, of course, I mean, we're not doing this discussion for donors, but sometimes maybe not to come in with a project, but rather having a fund where local initiatives can grow and draw from. I mean, I see this, for example, I mean, quite happy to see, for example, how some initiatives like RICO and other regional initiatives actually provide for, you know, small seed money for local initiatives. And I think that's probably a much more productive way forward, where it's not about the large money where you have to know the language. I mean, we haven't mentioned it, but also the language of donors, not just English, but also the project language of stakeholders and SWOT analysis and all of the terminology, which often precludes certain types of civil society to even participate because they're not as skilled with that. And I think often let's say the secular, you know, kind of well-established NGOs often are monopolizing this space because they know how to speak the language of the donor. And sometimes it's better to have something where somebody who isn't as polished in the language of donors, but who also maybe doesn't need 100,000 euros, but maybe needs just 2,000 euros to do something locally in a small municipality to bring people together. And, you know, whether it's having a joint vegetable garden or I don't know, whatever else it may be. And so I think these kind of spaces are missing because, again, we don't have the external donors don't give money to that, and then there isn't local sources of really, you know, kind of inclusive funding or support for these kind of initiatives.
This is exactly, Florian. This is exactly what we have done in Krajina, in Prijedor and in Sanski Most. And it's also a matter, I mean, of language and naming. Very often we use interreligious and intercultural dialogue. So what people do in local communities falls into this category, but they don't name it like that. So, for instance, just one example that came to my mind right now, that a group of local activists from Sanski Most decided to visit one of the villages in Prijedor with majority of Serbian Orthodox population. And they found one of their teachers from high school who was retired and who lived in really poor conditions. And they decided to rebuild her house, to help her to rebuild her house. And they said, okay, we have done it, but we didn't call it interreligious or intercultural dialogue. What they have done was dialogue of life. So they helped the person in need, and she was one of their teachers before the war. So these kind of grassroots initiatives can help more than, you know, dozens of conferences and shaking hands in media of religious leaders, although it is sometimes important because it sends symbolic message. And so it just came to my mind and I wanted to share that.
Thanks. Yeah, so I mean, I think, of course, as you rightly say, there is a larger space. I mean, and this is why even the symbolic and even sometimes maybe you can say devoid of much substance declarations of interreligious cooperation are important, because they create space where local initiatives can develop, because they send a signal saying, yes, you know, we're not against this kind of cooperation. But then, of course, the real work is happening at the local level, at the grassroots level. And indeed, it might not be called at all what we're talking about. You don't have to use the word civil society. You don't have to use the word religious dialogue. And in fact, I find it often, again, it's just like, you know, you don't do reconciliation by reconciliation project. You don't need to call it like that. You don't need to. So I think we need to kind of move away from these labels and rather think about ways in which these things can take place at the local level, at the pace and also through the language of whatever local, you know, initiatives can emerge and can really bring some benefits. And that, I mean, I think the problem is at the end one has to give trust to local communities. I mean, I think this is a lot of it is about that. Is I think from the donor perspective, the outsider perspective, to trust local communities to know better what is good for them and what they need, and also to trust them to be able to do it. I mean, I think there's a lot of problem with that of course, if you're a grant giver, you want to be in control of the money. But I think there's a need to also trust those who are the supposed beneficiaries, that they probably know a lot better that it's building a house for an old lady or things like that might do a lot more good than the more what an outside planner might think is appropriate. Angela, I don't know if you want to come in at this point, if you have anything to share with.
Yes, just very generally, I think it is important to say, although it's already been implicitly implied, that a lot of even religious or interreligious initiatives, grassroots initiatives in Southeastern Europe have not survived. Or are kind of surviving but languishing. And I see two big reasons for that. One of them is the financing and this whole cluster of issues that we have just discussed. And another one is that they have often not been able to move on from their founder figure. And so when the founder figure, who's basically holding everything together, because they thought of the idea, they are the initiators, and they had not been able to build up a network of people doing it with them. As soon as they move on, whether they change jobs or locations or they die, which we have seen in several instances, the organization cannot really continue or just has to close down. Yeah. So I think these are very much issues kind of connected to the same cluster we have discussed. Those kinds of initiatives should be supported, and should be supported also locally, if possible.
And I mean, I think the question which comes with that is also, how do you, because I think there's always this, in what we talked about, there's the gap between many citizens' willingness to become engaged in what we conventionally call civil society, because it's understood in a particular way as being a job, basically, and rather than something which articulates their demands. But people are willing to become active. You know, we had seen protests. I mean, I'm thinking a protest in Bosnia about small hydroelectric power stations. We had something in Serbia, similarly, in Zenica about the smelter, the environmental pollution. So we have these movements which are people are willing to engage when it comes to environmental issues, for example, and people are willing to go to the streets, to even in Serbia they demolished a pipe which was built destroying a river. So these kind of social engagements do happen, and they show that citizens are quite willing to do so if they're provided with the right channel. And I think the problem is that many citizens don't see civil society, as it's been talked about for the last 25 years or so, as the channel which is where they see themselves participating in. But they are willing to participate in other forms, become socially engaged. So I'm just kind of wondering, and maybe we can make this as a kind of concluding round, is kind of reflecting on, how can citizens become engaged, and how to take them to that level of wider engagement, because it's, of course, the problem is that many of these forms of engagement are very ephemeral, right? You participate in a protest and then that is over, and then either you succeed or you don't, but it doesn't take it to the next level of being transformative necessarily. So how do you carry citizens onwards into kind of social engagement, as well as then, of course, into these larger processes which we've been talking about?
That's a very tough question.
I know. I'm sorry. I know there's probably no good answer for it, but I'm just kind of curious.
Yeah, I'm afraid I don't have an answer. I mean, if I have, I will be probably sitting somewhere in Brussels, filing one of the big projects. I mean, there are ways, to engage people, but then people got disappointed, and then they don't see the future. For instance, after the protests, or they don't see, how to continue. But there should be kind of a structure and network that can provide continuity. Otherwise, I mean, citizens can, participate to 1 or 2 or 3 protests, and then what? They had to go back and to do their work, to to work on their farms or to do their jobs. So there should be, you know, a way to provide a more sustainable network that can lead the entire process. So we have several networks, you know, Peace Network, Women's Network, networks of eco-organizations, etc. But most of these organizations became project-driven organizations. And one of the problems also, which is visible in the last 5-6 years, that most of the big international organizations at UN level and some even state institutions do the work of civil society organizations. They're now employing people 20, 30, 50 with big salaries, and they give, you know, tiny portions of budget to local organizations. And then people in local communities, when they see that, you know, what's going on, they then have confidence, I mean, that something can happen, because state institutions started to receive money from international organizations to do the work of civil society, and even these big organizations do that work. So which means none of them support grassroots initiatives. So that's why it is hard, you know, to move them, to engage them more, you know, to do some more substantial work and to believe in what they are doing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Angela. The $1 million question, as they say.
Yeah, well, of course, there's no easy answer to that. I think one component I would emphasize is education, and education in terms of, especially in Southeastern Europe, it's so important that we move away from a way of defining ourselves and others as categories that are incompatible with each other. And I think also in that, not only schools and others play an important part, but also the religious communities themselves, to start kind of moving beyond that we are different because of this one characteristic in our lives, and to somehow create solidarity and understanding. But of course, you cannot do that unless you learn about the others. And I think that's extremely important. And with that, I'm kind of bringing us back to the beginning when Zilka was talking about religious education in public schools. We have that now in almost every country of the region. And we have seen that even in instances where it was originally planned to be more inclusive in terms of not just learning about one's own religious tradition, but also dedicating a certain portion of the time to learning about other religious traditions and to learn about how they can work together. We have seen a much more confessional religious education taking place. And I think that is one of the key issues that needs to change and needs to become a bit broader, so that it also becomes, just as you have said, integrated more into also cultural studies, a study of the history of religions, and many more topics touching upon these often very closed, doctrinally oriented views. Because I think that is one of the keys. Of course, such education doesn't only take place in schools. I'm also talking about what the religious communities themselves communicate to their own members and also to the members of others. And I think we need to see a little bit more of, let's say, inclusivity or acceptance. We saw only a few years ago, there were so many, and I think it hasn't stopped, unfortunately, and in some cases it's even rising, acts of intolerance against persons or objects, buildings, cemeteries of religious communities. There's anti-Semitism on the rise in the region as well. A lot of other similar disturbing developments. And unless we learn more about each other, we cannot expect to respect or agree to disagree with the others. So I think, in my eyes, that's one of the keys.
Yeah, and also I would add, you know, to really take seriously this secular religious divide, because I work across this divide most of the time. And when I talk to secular people, I mean, they cannot understand why I believe in God and why I'm doing this. And then people in religious communities cannot understand why I'm supporting some of the issues in secular sphere. So I think we need to put more emphasis on that. And we can do a lot for our society if we join our resources and capacities, and instead of constantly attacking each other, you know, try to find a way to communicate, to listen. And I'm afraid that our public discourse, especially media discourse, is really problematic, and it's full of negative statements, and you know, just you know, trying to find what is negative, what is bad somewhere, instead of looking, you know, what is good, and let's build up on what is good. And there is good in everywhere, and then we can find it if we are really ready to search carefully, and if we have open eyes and minds.
I think, thanks. And I think this is, I mean, there are a couple of, I think, very important concluding messages which I take from those. I mean, I think one of the points is, of course, and this is the problem. I mean, if we're looking at politically and societally, many of the societies in Southeastern Europe are highly polarized, and it's not just along national lines. That I think that they often, those debates often overshadow other types of polarization, and they are, as you said, sometimes there could be sometimes among political parties, you know, if you're in opposition or in government, or religious or secular. But of course, these polarizations are beneficial for those who want to exercise power in a divisive way, because of course, if you want to exercise power, you polarize, because you bind a particular part of the society to yourself, and you create an enemy, so to speak, very easily. And this is of course a very negative dynamic, which is a problem to build. You know, to build an inclusive democratic society, you need to basically fundamentally accept people to be different than yourself, and still be a legitimate member of your own society. I mean, this is the basic premise of all of that you don't have to agree with everybody, but you have to agree that they are part of the community you're sharing, and you give space to them. And of course, you know, you have to negotiate the boundaries. I mean, I will not share space with a National Socialist. I mean, this is for me beyond the boundaries of acceptability or a racist, but you have to set these boundaries, but they have to be a negotiation of inclusiveness and exclusiveness. And I think this is the problem, that they're often too exclusive and not open enough to those who are, you know, different by religion or secular or non-secular orientation, but fundamentally accept the basic premises of human dignity and certain rights. And I guess it's really there where it's about creating these spaces, how to reclaim the public space. I mean, it's very interesting when we're having this conversation. You know, I've been following a lot of social movements in the region, which are often about spaces, about reclaiming public spaces. You know, from the Gezi protests in Istanbul to protests in Maribor, they're often about public spaces which are privatized, which are taken away by states, and citizens rebel against that. Sometimes it's nature which is destroyed, and sometimes it's urban spaces, but it's this sense that people are deprived of spaces. And I think we can translate this also in the sense of you know, social spaces where people can meet, and which are not predetermined to be either one or the other, but you know, which are open in a certain way and inclusive. And I think this is really where I would you know, take the conclusion from our conversation today, is that there aren't enough of those spaces, and that it's not easy to create them, and that you certainly cannot create them by the outside, kind of ex machina, with a clear idea of how they should look like, but they need to be generated from within by local communities who need to define how they do it and what they want to do with them, and that outsiders can offer ideas and can offer resources, but at the end it has to be a locally driven process, and one which is built gradually, and also one which grows over time. Again, these are not two-year projects. These are generational projects, if anything, to operate in. So I think we can, unless any of you would like to add some last reflection, I think we can conclude with those observations. I think we've had a very important discussion on this topic, and of course a lot more can and will be discussed, because we will have 2 more panels of this conference series online. The next one will take place next Thursday, the 6th of May. We'll have a panel on how different religious communities in Southeastern Europe approach civil society. We'll have another panel. The last panel will be on the 20th of May, which is going to look at the larger question theoretically, what is civil society in the region? And I'm sure that they will pick up many of the threads we have had today in our conversation. So with that, I'd say thank you very much to Zilka for joining us today and sharing your thoughts. Thank you. And Angela as well. Thank you for sharing and jumping in at short notice, and as if it wasn't short notice, your thoughts were extremely important. So thanks to both of you, and thanks to those of you who are listening, and hope to